Before I introduce the panel, I'd just like to provide some background on the task force. The task force was comprised of a diverse group of employee and municipal associations, municipalities, administrative officials, industry experts, and legislators. The task force met 10 times between February and May for half-day sessions. A lot of discussion took place. Their work resulted in a report that was released in July, outlining their key findings and recommendations for the legislature to consider when addressing pension and retiree health care liability. And we're pleased to have 4 of the task force members with us today. I welcome back MERS CEO, Krista Rose. We have Tony Mangini, Deputy Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer with the Michigan Municipal League.
Thanks, Brad.
Dave LaMontagne, Executive Board Member with the Police Officers Association of Michigan, and our State Treasurer, Nick Coury. Thank you all for being here today.
Oh, thank you.
Now, we do have a lot to cover. I have prepared questions, but we really want to take questions from the audience and want to allow time for that. So I'm just going to dive into my first question for background purposes. Nick, could you give us an overview of the challenges and pressures that led Governor Snyder to create the task force?
Sure, be happy to. First, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. It is an important, interesting, timely topic you're going to spend the next day and a half on. So thank you again for the invitation. So what started the task force? Well, I think the recognition among a broad group of folks throughout the state that there's a problem. There's a problem we need to address, and the problem is growing. It's a problem not just in Michigan. It's an issue that affects many states across the country, in the Midwest and on both coasts. And the problem is we have a growing liability, unfunded liability, the term that's used. In other words, we're making commitments to employees that unless something changes, we won't be able to meet in all cases. And so that's really what unfunded liability means. It really means, are we setting aside enough money today to meet the commitments we're making to employees today? And right now, we're really not. We think, the data is really sketchy. We've probably got the best data in the department of anyone, but it's so spread out across the state. Every local government is unique. But we think there's probably about $19 billion of unfunded liability right now for retirees and future retirees. And that's split about $10 billion in pensions and about $9 billion in health care, mostly health care. It's called OPEB. And that number keeps growing. That's the first issue, is we're not setting aside enough money now to meet the commitments we're making to employees now. The second issue is even though the money, and the money we're spending now is starting to crowd out other expenditures for local governments across the state. In some cases, up to 25% now of a local government's general fund is being spent on retiree health care, retiree pensions. So it's crowding out other spending at the local unit, whether it's transportation, health and human services, other priorities of locals. So unfunded liability, the money we are paying is starting to crowd out other expenditures. Now, the other thing I want to say is it's not just an urban problem. Some of the more severe problems are in our urban areas, but it's spread out across the state, but not evenly. Many local governments in Michigan, there's about 1,500. About 360 of those local governments, as best we can tell, have a defined benefit health care, and about 600 have pension. So many local governments don't have a problem at all. They don't have a plan. And many of those local governments who have a plan don't have a problem. So it's not all local governments, but it's not any one type of government. So how did we get here? Well, any complex problem has a complex answer. And there are 4 or 5 or maybe 6 different reasons we got to where we're at. People like to emphasize one over the other, or like to emphasize 4 out of 5, but they all play some role. First is demographics, simple demographics. So people are living longer, and obviously the financial obligation on the part of the local government is bigger as people live longer. So the old days of, again, it's well-deserved, I'm not saying that, but work start at 20, retire at 40, earn retirement to 90, it's not as affordable as average life increases. And the second is because of the changes over the last decade at local governments, many local governments have 5 or 6 retirees to every current worker. So basic demographics are a problem. Unrealistic assumptions, including investment returns after the Great Recession, have really hurt plans across the board, including other assumptions like this rolling 30-year amortization. It's kind of a technical issue, but if you're always rolling your commitment to pay off your unfunded liability and every year you just roll it out, you're never going to get there. So part of it was these assumptions that haven't been true. Part of it is healthcare costs. Healthcare costs have been greatly exceeding inflation. For example, last year healthcare costs rose 6%, inflation was 1.7%. So obviously retiree healthcare increases. All healthcare costs increase, but retiree healthcare costs. Part of it was benefit increases that during the good years that now aren't affordable. Whether it's that we don't do it anymore, the infamous 13th check, or whether it's the way we calculate compensation or early outs with full. There were all kinds of benefit changes that now are coming back when the plans aren't in good shape. And then finally, the last thing, and then I'll turn it over, is we haven't had a tradition of funding retiree health care, either in the private sector or the public sector. About 10 years ago, the private sector caught on and has started funding. Governments are coming much slower. For example, in Michigan, we have about $3 billion of assets set aside to fund retiree health care, of commitments we've already made, but we've got about $12 billion of liabilities. So $3 billion set aside, $12 billion. So we're only starting to talk about what's the right way to fund OPEB, retiree health care, and how do we get on a path that we fund it like we do pensions. It's a commitment like pensions, and we ought to fund it, not as a pay-as-you-go, but we ought to fund it like we do pensions. So that's a long-winded way of saying, here's the view of the problem, here's some of the things that have led to it, and the governor's task force was can we find a way to solve this problem?
Did the governor give any specific direction to the task force?
Yeah, find the problem, find the solution. Find the solution that can pass the legislature.
That's why he's in charge.
That's why I'm in charge. In all honesty, can we find a way to balance the interests? The interests of employees, especially current retirees, but also active workers, the interest to attract and retain an active workforce in government, but the interests of local governments to retain healthy finances throughout the period, and the interests of taxpayers. There are no easy answers here. There are trade-offs, and so can we find the right balance of those trade-offs? And then the other thing he said is, I have been talking since I started in this job a couple years ago, that really what we need to work on collectively is to provide a sounder financial footing for local units of government. And there are 3 categories. There's this unfunded liability we're talking about, efficient provision of services, and a stable revenue base. And we're talking about all 3, but the governor said for this task force to make it manageable, let's focus on the first. And so that was his direction to us.
Okay, thank you. Chris, during the task force discussions, was there anything else that was on the table or off the table?
Yeah, when you look at the list of folks that were on this, not all of them are pension and healthcare experts. So early on in the task force, we needed to do a little bit of education on sort of the laws of the state of Michigan. For many in this room, some of this will be obvious to you, but pensions are constitutionally protected, and we've been pre-funding them. That's the law in Michigan. From a healthcare perspective, though, they're not constitutionally protected. The retiree healthcare benefits aren't. And there hasn't been a requirement to pre-fund, so most have not pre-funded the benefits. We're all aware that pension liabilities are now showing up on our books, and soon these retiree health care liabilities will as well. So that's increasing the pressure to address the problem. And then in Michigan, the vast majority of these benefits are negotiated through collective bargaining agreements, so there are contractual commitments that have been made that have to be honored or at least reviewed before you can make changes in benefits.
Tony, how did local flexibility fare in the discussion of the task force?
Well, I mean, that was something that we put a lot of emphasis around because it certainly isn't a one-size-fits-all problem, so you're not going to have a one-size-fits-all solution. I mean, Nick touched on a lot of points. There's a variety of reasons that we got to where we are. I can remember when healthcare was almost a throwaway. I mean, healthcare was a very cheap benefit that you provided. No one could have anticipated the exponential growth in that. When you look at life expectancy, all these different things. And as Nick points out, I mean, there wasn't a requirement to pre-fund this. What you end up with is what we have right now. And so I think we're very thoughtful about saying, how can we approach this in a way that's going to make sense? So I know from our perspective, we put a lot of energy into the idea that you do need to make sure you're providing a good healthcare benefit for the folks that work for you, but we got to be smarter about how we're going to be able to provide that. So looking for ways to provide flexibility, more cost-effective delivery of those services. And we put most of our emphasis and energy around the OPEB side of the equation. As Chris points out, for 50 years, we've had a constitutional requirement to fund pensions. And so to the extent that they might be unfunded, it probably has more to do with some of these factors outside of control, like investment returns and life expectancy, than folks saying, we're not putting money into that. OPEB, in contrast, we haven't put any money into that. It's also a lot harder to predict. I mean, pensions are a lot, you know what you're signing up for. I mean, OPEB is sort of an open door. And so one of the things that we've struggled with, you have plan designs that go back over decades. And when that benefit was promised, we talk about the promise that was made to the employee in terms of deductibles and benefits. What we don't talk about is the level of health care that was promised, because that was a completely different world at that point. And so when you think about drug costs and the types of services that are now available, that's really changed the equation as well. So taking a long and thoughtful look at that, I think, is something that's going to happen community by community, maybe bargaining unit by bargaining unit as we work through these things. And I think if we're thoughtful about it, there's an opportunity here to make some real meaningful change, because we've got to squeeze this cost down. As Nick points out, it's crowding out our ability to provide services, and that's really what we got to get our arms around.
All right.
Can I just add one thing?
Sure.
Just on pensions, I think it's true that healthcare is a problem for more governments across the state. Pensions, on average, are well funded. We have a history of funding pensions. But there are a small group of districts, relatively small, we'll talk about how many, that have written checks they can't cash on pensions. They don't have the tax base. They have an active worker to employ that's 5 to 1, 6 to 1. They are never going to get there. So while more broadly the problem is health care from a local units of government, there's a group of local units whose pensions are in serious problems.
Yeah, thanks. Dave, I understand public safety played a key role in the task force discussions. Can you talk from your perspective about the retirement needs and how liabilities are being addressed within your agreements?
Yeah, sure. And I guess if you think about it, and we've all thought about it, the composition of that task force was, I think, pretty interesting. And I guess thanks to the governor for including working folks and people that actually get pensions and know what we're talking about. Because I think we gathered in this room being apparent to some people what they did not know. Nobody here, of course. And that was a rather telling kind of situation. So when you think about these things, I am basically the face of this problem, if you think about it. I served my country, the United States Marine Corps. Then I served my community for over 26 years as a police officer. I get health care and pension from my employer. And I bought 4 years of military time. So I am the problem child here, right? The face of this issue. So, from a perspective of, a union guy, a guy that's, negotiating collectively with our employers to try to solve these issues, right? As these guys have eloquently stated, this was never a problem back in the day, right? We've had a one-state recession. We've got some significant problems. Tony hasn't mentioned revenue sharing yet. I always like to get him going on the notion of revenue sharing. Hopefully that'll come up at some point.
I'll work it in at some point.
Yeah. So all of these things have come together to kind of put this on people's radar. That debt has always been there, right? Now, municipalities are going to be forced to report this. It goes on their balance sheet, and people that count beans have issues with that, apparently. So I guess, policemen, firemen, if you think about, a lot of municipalities, they don't get Social Security benefits, right? So this was the thing that was negotiated. That's your benefit, right? In my industry, in the public sector, we defer compensation to the back end, right? We defer it from the front end to the back end, unlike the private sector who is getting compensated heavily all the time with no benefits. So that's like the trade-off, and that discussion didn't resonate with some people who don't necessarily understand this issue, never going to get a pension, never going to stay in a municipality for over 5 years, right? These hired guns go from place to place to place. So, you know, I do thank the governor that he was thoughtful when he constructed that panel. We had tremendous discussions, and interestingly enough, agreed on many, many things. There was just some things we just couldn't do. And, you know, we continue to talk about it. We should continue to talk about it because it's not going away. But, you know, over the course, I mean, since 2008, frankly, we, and I say we, the Police Officers Association of Michigan and a lot of other folks have been bargaining collectively with our employer to solve this issue, right? There wasn't anybody that knows that this wasn't going to be a problem. So what do we do, right? We changed benefit structures. We changed compensation structures. We changed, you know, DB to DC in some places. We changed healthcare. All of these things, bargained collectively with our employer. You know, Tony likes to talk about, you know, local control. There's no one solution, which is good news because that's traditionally not what Lansing tells us. So that's good, and it's been thoughtful, productive discussions, and, you know, I feel a lot better about it now than I did a little while back. So I think that as we continue to talk about this thing, people that don't necessarily understand what's going on will get better at it. And then we have to keep educating. You know, MERS educates you guys, your members, and management folks. And that process is going to have to continue. But, you know, we've recognized this issue with our employers long ago, and anybody working for a living in here knows that to be a fact. So we have changed, but it's slow. Municipalities are slow to catch up for a variety of reasons. Contracts, a certain term impacts your ability to bargain these issues. So some of those things play into, you know, this problem.
All right, thank you for that. Now, Chris, based on, you know, what Nick was saying, that there are some municipalities that may not be able to address this problem. Dave talked about how they are working with municipalities on their contracts and addressing benefit issues. Can you talk about what MERS customers have been doing to address the growing liabilities?
Sure. Tomorrow I'll provide a whole bunch of data that will expand on what I'm about to say. But at a high level, if you break it into two parts, from a retiree healthcare perspective, and you think of MERS having about 800 municipalities, member municipalities, we have 300 municipalities that have gone into the healthcare savings program, so a defined contribution savings program for healthcare. Many of them are also asking MERS they're saving money for those liabilities, so they've begun the pre-funding process, and they're asking us to invest those monies, or they're investing them locally. So they're beginning to fund, and they're changing the benefits, at least for new employees. From a pension perspective, 75% of those 800 municipalities have taken some action to lower their costs or lower their liabilities. So examples would be asking employees to pay more, lowering benefits, new tiers of benefits going forward, hybrid plans for new employees, a part defined contribution, part defined benefit plan, going fully to a defined contribution plan. Some have bonded, and on top of that, and we see this as we get farther and farther away from 2008, people are making greater contributions. So 50% of the people in this room, 50% of our customer base, MERS tells you what your minimum contribution is, 50% of those folks are putting in extra contributions. And then lastly, last year MERS provided another tool for those of you that are relatively well-funded to extend out the schedule with which you make payments on unfunded liability.
Thank you. So hopefully this gives you a good background on some of the discussion that was being had within those 10 half-day sessions. Now, Nick, would you give us an overview of the report findings and recommendations?
Sure. Let me just summarize a few things in the report. Well, let me step back a little bit first and say, you know, I've been at this a long time, and I learned early on that we get the government we can afford, not the government we deserve. Yeah, I've learned that early on. And so when you step back and say, there's differences among everyone up here and differences in the task force, but essentially we're all on the same page, which is it's in no one's interest to be committing to employees benefits that aren't going to be honored in the future. And so we all had the same goal, which is how do we treat current retirees fairly? How do we make this expense manageable for local units of government and so they can do other things? And how do we balance that against taxpayers and taxpayers' requirements and desires? So at a really high level, there was agreement. There was agreement at another level of some of the early issues. You know, the task force recommended more transparency on the part of reporting. You know, we've reported pensions for a long, long time. We're just getting into reporting OPEB, so there's no real single data source. So there's transparency issues. There was some agreement on at least minimum funding on the part of local governments for OPEB. That pay-as-you-go fundamentally as a policy doesn't make sense. How much they should fund, there was all kinds of disagreement. And then there was agreement on setting up some kind of state board that would both monitor the fiscal health of local units of government. We do that now, but to really take a more laser focus on retiree health care and retiree pension. So we'd set up this board, and the Department of Treasury, we always end up doing all of this, would look at all the data and identify potential problems, and hopefully like we do for schools now, not just current problems, but potential problems down the road, what are the trends. And so then we'd filter it out, think about it as a big filter. We have 1,500 districts. We'd look at some objective measures and say, well, you might have a problem, so we'll talk to the local units and say, do you have a plan in place? And if they don't have a plan, then we'll work with them to get a plan. So there was some agreement, and that's what you're seeing here is all these stages. I wouldn't get too hung up on the specifics because the task force is over. It started the debate. It's not ending the debate. But this broad concept of focusing on distressed local units of government and making sure they put together a plan. Now, there was a lot of disagreement as to what happens after that. What's the role of this board? Personally, I think what came out in the task force will not make any difference to the problem. And I've said that over and over again that, just setting up another bureaucracy to take reports. We've got that all the time in Michigan. So we need a little bit something more. But at least this idea of the problem is not across the board, it's localized. We need to work with local governments and the unions that represent the employees to try and find a financially stable plan that gets them on the path towards funding of OPEB and pension.
Can I just add to that too? I think that, and Nick said this early on, but I want to drive this point home. This is one leg of the stool, right? I mean, this is a huge issue, something we've got to get our arms around. But part of the challenge and part of where I think some of the disagreement comes from is what's that right balance between service provision and how you deliver services and then laying this on top of it. And that's where the dance starts, really get going a little bit. So I think we got to keep that in our sights. That's where I'm going to do the revenue sharing thing for you. So, because really funding is a huge part of this, and the paradigm of funding has changed over time, and how we deliver services is changing as well. So it's all part of that equation, and that's what I think complicates this conversation significantly.
That's a good point, thank you. Can one of you talk about, on the first stage of the transparency and reporting, we had talked about how we have been collecting data on pension and not so much on OPEB, but could you speak a bit to the uniform assumptions of what role that plays?
Well,
it does. Right? Look at him.
Yeah.
There's a couple ways to address it. One is it's hard to look at apples to apples across your local units if everyone's using different assumptions. Now, there may be good reasons to have different assumptions. If you have different workforce, you have different investment portfolios. So I'm not saying that one size fits all is kind of the theme of the report, but we need some kind of standard reporting. And now, having said that, as Dave mentioned, the accountants are forcing it to us anyway. I mean, that's what GASB, which is the accounting group, they have recognized a long time ago that retiree health care is just like pensions, that you need to have a better job of disclosing it. It has to be on your balance sheet. It has to be considered debt like any other debt. So they are going to force some consistent assumptions, consistent transparency anyway. So in a way, the report was just acknowledging what the accountants are going to make us do anyway.
Okay, so it was more of just a reporting mechanism.
At this point, it's a reporting mechanism.
Okay.
For funding, some people had argued everybody should use 7% investment return. You know, I personally don't think that really makes sense because people have different portfolios. If you have all bonds, 7% is too high. If you have a mix, 7% might be okay. So forcing for a funding decision, uniform assumptions may not make sense, but from a reporting so we can see apples to apples, it may make sense. And again, that's what GASB's doing too. Everything they're saying has nothing to do really with funding. It just has to do with reporting and accounting for it.
Can I
All
jump
right,
in here?
thanks.
Just
Sure.
from the perspective of a union guy, like when I cruise around our great state here negotiating, one of the first things I do is I look at the municipality's dashboard, which I think is a tremendous tool. And this filter, as our distinguished treasurer likes to talk about, that reporting requirement is going to be, I think, very significant. So not only we, you know, the people working for a living, but taxpayers will be able to look at, you know, how these things are being paid for. And, you know, if there's an issue, you know, these things are going to pop up. I mentioned earlier, I served in the Marines, and, you know, one of the first things you talk about is you got to stop the bleeding. And we got to stop lying to ourselves about, you know, how we're paying for these things, kicking the can down the road. That's not good for anybody, okay, including the people that are on the receiving end of the benefit. So I think this thing here that you see, and many of you may be seeing it for the first time, there was widely speculated that people just read the executive summary, then, you know. But this thing here, I think, is of some significance. I like it. I support it. Gets a little shady there at stage 5. I'm not sure what that's going to be looking like. But, you know, we need to have municipalities reporting the truth. And then we need to have them talk about, if there's an issue, how are you going to fund this? Okay, you got to spell it out. And those conversations between municipalities and the treasurer's office are going to be invaluable because alarm bells are going to go off when people start doing hinky stuff. And every now and again that happens. So I like this, with the caveat being stage 5, I don't know. We'll probably have to talk about that some more, but this is good news. And this is, I look at this as like the crowning achievement of that mind-numbing task that we entered into. Because for the first time, we're going to have an honest discussion with ourselves about what's that number, right? We know what the number is on the pension side. We do not know what it is on the OPEB side. Well, some of us know, but good, right? We're going to figure it out. And there's going to be, like you mentioned, an apples for apples. Everybody's going to be reporting on the same thing, so you can look at your municipality against his municipality and say, okay, we're good, we're bad, what are we doing, what are they doing, let's figure this thing out. And I'll just one last thing is, there are municipalities that will never, this is never going to fix it for them. They are so upside down. The names, you've heard them all. So you've got that piece of that, and then you got the people that are rocking and rolling, and the people in the middle, that's going to be where the meat of the work is done, and they're going to be able to report this stuff. We're all going to be able to see it. It's going to be the same stuff, apples for apples, and it'll be a good comparison. I like it.
You know, if I could just build on, I mean, I think you talk about, you know, the comparing of everyone back and forth, and I think that is an important thing. We can't lose sight of the fact that local governments provide pensions and OPEB because they're in business. They're not in business to provide pensions and OPEB. So striking that balance, making sure we have a sustainable benefit over time. You know, Nick threw out the stat, 6 to 1 some places have. I can remember 100 years ago walking into my mayor's office and saying, wow, do you realize that at this point in the future, we're going to have more retirees than employees? And so just a little bit over a 1-to-1. And he was like, get out of my office, that's crazy, right? I mean, I don't think any of us could have ever dreamed we'd be at 600. That is absolutely unsustainable. I don't know how you fix those places. That's going to be a problem. So a huge focus has got to be, how do we build this in a way that it's sustainable? Sustainable for your people, sustainable for mine, sustainable for the state in general. That's what we've got to get to. And I think that's the one thing I like about the report, is it does give us the data. It is a jumping off point to have a conversation around it, because it's in everyone's best interest to get to that place.
I was going to, Dave gave me an opportunity to give a shameless plug. Treasury is about to roll out, or we are rolling out something like that soon, a dashboard for all local governments. So, you know, local governments themselves have been putting up dashboards. We're going to have a one-stop where you can compare any local government anywhere across the state for overall financial performance, but also OPEB in pension. And I think transparency is good. But, you know, this is good, but, you know, I've got in my office, not literally, but a stack of deficit elimination plans from cities and schools. We've been doing that forever, and it has very, very little impact. I mean, there's nothing easier than writing a plan, submitting it to Treasury, and Treasury says, yeah, okay, great, you know, stars are going to come out and everything's perfect. So transparency is really, really important. Putting together a plan is okay, but if it just stops with putting together a plan, we'll make some progress, but we're not going to solve the fundamental problem. There needs to be something in stage 5, and this is where there was disagreement about what happens in stage 5.
Well, you somewhat answered my next question, because I wanted to ask each of you what was one thing that you wanted to highlight from the report, and it sounds like that the transparency and the reporting would be helpful. We've talked about how there are some municipalities that the transparency and reporting in a plan may not help. Is there anything else that you'd like to add? Is there one thing that you want to highlight, or one thing that you don't think was addressed that needs to be addressed?
If I could go first, I'm...
It's your conference, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Tony. I do think that the transparency and the steps, if implemented, are going to shine a bright light on how well funded and whether the benefits can be afforded. I think one of my disappointments with the task force was something that Nick and Dave have both said in different ways, which is there are a number of communities, I can't tell you whether it's 10 or 20 or it's 50 in this state, that are losing population, losing tax base, don't have the ability to cut the benefits enough to make them affordable, don't have tools. And so maybe there's some in this room. And so we didn't get to the point, well, so what are we going to do? What are we going to do about that? And those solutions, unfortunately, are probably going to be outside the boundaries of those communities. And so we didn't get there, so that was a disappointment. But I think if we implement this, at least we'll have a really keen sense of which communities those are.
Yeah, and I would echo what Chris said. I think there was a point there where I was hopeful we would actually come out the backside with, this is a plan to go forward, and I think we fell short of that. Having said that, I think it's really important that over the next several months, we end up in a place where it's sustainable for the long term, not in the near term, not let's make this go away for 3 or 5, but we've changed the future for our communities in Michigan, because that's what we need to do, is have something that's sustainable. What we have right now is not. And even places that say, well, we fixed our problem, right? We've closed our systems. They can be opened. I mean, so does that make sense or not? We got to have those conversations as well and make sure we have a long-term sustainable plan that everyone can rely upon, because someone 10 years from now, they shouldn't have a different panel with 3 different people sitting here talking about, you know, what did we do? What would you have done different than the group of 10 years ago? You know, not you're doing it. I think we got to make sure we get this right, because we probably don't get another bite at this apple.
Would anyone like to add anything?
I guess if, I'm hoping there's some decent questions, so I don't want to filibuster here, so I'll just pass.
You know, and I'd just say, it depends what the expectations were. I never thought the task force would come out with a blueprint for legislation that we'd then submit. I don't think that was the goal, at least from my perspective, working on too many task force. The expectation was we were going to get together, we were going to understand our positions, understand the data, and agree to some general principles. And I think we did that. This idea of flexibility, it's not a uniform problem, so we don't need a uniform solution. That funding of OPEB is important, and we should start funding OPEB. That we need to minimize, at all possible, impact on current retirees. And so there were some general principles that we agreed to. So in that sense, I think the task force was a success. Did it go far enough? I would have written it differently, but you know, again, that's part of a task force. I wasn't even a voting member. I just did all the work. But so, you know, there's 20 people on the task force. So I think we agreed on some basic principles.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to ask you all to pull out your crystal ball and share what you see the next 3 to 6 months looking like as it relates to, you just said this isn't meant to be the blueprint. What do you foresee happening? If we could maybe start with you, Nick.
Well, a lot of talk, a lot of meetings. I do think the governor, this is one of his top 2 priorities for the remainder of the year. The majority leader of the Senate has said it's one of his top 2 priorities, and the speaker has said he's interested in working on it. So It is on people's agenda. In Lansing, the first issue is not the substance of the policy, but is it on people's agenda? Because there's so much we could work on. And this is going to get a lot of debate. And will something come out of that debate? You know, forecasting the legislative process makes forecasting weather look like a science. Who knows what's going to happen? There may be a bill that has a reporting requirement that, as I said, in my opinion, doesn't make a lot of difference, but it doesn't hurt, kind of helps. So maybe that's it. Maybe there'll be a more strict framework. I don't really know what's going to happen. I just know there will be bills introduced. There's going to be a lot of debate. There's going to be a debate in the legislature. If it's going to happen, it's got to happen between now and the end of the year, because next year is kind of off the table. So that's my best guess. I have no idea what actually passes.
Okay.
Am I next?
You are?
So I'm going to assume there's some members of POAM in here, and POAM.net, we always update these conversations, and we are having these conversations literally every day. And I'm in the business of protecting benefits for our people, both active and retired. Which is why you just can't ignore that this is going to go away. It's not going away. We have been bargaining collaboratively with our employers, but we're always behind, right, for a variety of reasons. So as it pertains to people in here that are recently retired or going to be retired in a minute, I feel comfortable that there won't be any crazy stuff happening in lame duck, but that is not a guarantee, because things do happen, and that's where we have to be vigilant. We've had these conversations. There's no secret where we come from. There's no secret where some of these legislators come from, and that's fine. We don't agree on everything. And what is particularly interesting to me is in this task force room, Tony represents the MML, the MAC, and the MTA. When we're all nodding our heads, yes, it's a little scary to me, because we're not supposed to be agreeing on this stuff. I'm not there yet. I'm getting there. So I just think that, this was a good first step. There's been a lot of education. Some of the representatives that were in there, a couple new, both sides of the aisle, kind of got an eye-opening as to what is really the problem. His office, awesome. These guys, subject matter experts. So there was no issue about that question couldn't be answered in that room, because there was some, high brain power in there. Not me, of course, but it's just, for our members, I think, be vigilant, but I think we're going to be okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk. I think it's a very accurate thing. I mean, daily there's conversations going in and around this stuff. I got two fears. One, that nothing happens, because that's a very real possibility. My bigger fear is something meaningless happens, like, say, roads, for example, where they declare victory because we passed something and now we don't have to talk about this anymore. That, to me, would be the biggest tragedy of this whole thing, because I think one of the good things that came out of the task force is there was a lot of real good conversation. As Dave points out, we had all sides represented, didn't always agree, but we got a lot of stuff on the table. I think everyone agrees what we have now isn't working particularly well, and we need to figure it out. We got to make sure that this is something that you guys can count on as the folks that are relying on those benefits, that we know we can provide, and that we can deliver services. And striking that balance is really important. So, I guess I don't think we get another crack at this, so I hope we get it right.
I guess the only thing I would add, echoing what you all have said, is most political pundits don't think that anything on this can get done next year, because it's an election year and both the House and the Senate are up, and so it can't be done next year. So I just hope we don't miss the opportunity that we've got. We've got probably a window to at least take a first step towards solving the problem.
Well, thank you. I think we'll open it up from questions from the audience now.
Yep.
Erin?
Yep. Is the mic on? The mic is on. So the first question that we received through the app, which the instructions are on the screen for those who are still submitting questions, kind of plays off your crystal ball question, Carrie. It goes a little bit further, though, so I think I'm still going to ask it. I think it might be a good one for Nick to start with, maybe. And it's around, what is the likelihood that the legislature is going to do their own thing on pension reform in spite of the task force recommendation?
Are they going to do their own thing? Well, it's kind of a weird way of saying it. I would say that welcome to democracy, right? The task force members don't vote. They're not elected. The legislature should do what they think is best, and you should vote them in or out depending on that. So that's kind of the flip answer. The answer is, how close will the final solution be to the task force? In the ballpark. I think the discussions I'm having now, other people having other discussions, use the task force as a framework. But I don't think anyone's constrained to say, well, the task force came up with these things and this is what we're going to write in the statute. So I think it's going to look similar in some ways, the basic framework. Probably this, whatever we call this board, is going to survive in some way. So it'll be close. It'll be close.
Okay. The next question that came in asked about has the panel reviewed or analyzed the impact of purchasing service credit to funding levels? Chris, you talked about how we're awarding all of our customers here another month's worth of service credit on their defined benefit plans. Is that something maybe you want to talk about?
Yeah, I can just briefly say that while there are many that believe that purchasing service credit is part of the reason why most public pension funds are underfunded to some degree, done right, which we think we do at MERS, you either as an employer, as a customer of ours, can choose not to have service purchases, so you can choose not to have them, you have the option. And secondly, if you do choose to have them, separating aside a small category, particularly military personnel, all the service purchases are actuarially sound. In other words, the amount of money that's put in is the appropriate amount, assuming our investment assumptions. So really not a key issue in the underfunded problem of pensions.
I want to follow up on that question, and I think I want to stay with Chris. Now, while I don't personally believe this, many of our teams and even myself have heard this when we're out with customers, and they may say that MERS is contributing to the issue of unfunded liabilities. And so I'm wondering if you can respond to that.
Yeah, I think I've certainly heard the same thing. I think if you translate what they're saying, we need to realize two things. One is that people are living longer. The second, that investment returns going forward are likely not going to be as good as they've been in the past. And tomorrow I'll give you some, lots of data on how well we've done on investment returns. But both of those factors lead to increased contributions. At the end, we need to pay pensions, and we need to have enough money to pay those pensions. Folks make contributions. The vast majority of the money that pays out in pensions is the investment returns. And with people living longer, you need more money. And with people with investment returns being less, more is going to have to go in. So MERS ends up being the entity for 85% of our municipalities that has to send out the bills and make the calculations of what those are. So we don't see ourselves as the problem, but we do see ourselves as the ones that have to make sure that the right amount is paid.
It's more, I mentioned it before, but it's more of a technical thing. In the old world, doing this 30-year rolling amortization without getting into the details, that just doesn't make any sense. And those days are gone. We need to address how you, so it's just a question of how long before you fund your unfunded liability, and that's just got to be changed. We've got to bring down the amortization period.
Yeah, and just to be
Not
clear,
MERS, I'm just talking about generally as a state.
But for the people in the room, most of you know this, right now if you have an open defined benefit plan, it's 22 years is what you're funding that over a fixed period of time. So.
And I'll just offer a little perspective too, because we hear the same thing in a different way. I think most folks think of that contribution almost like a fixed payment, like paying the electrical bill. And so I paid by payment, what do you mean I owe you more money? Because I think how it gets heard by, because this is a complicated issue, and if you don't play in this space, you don't understand some of that stuff. So I think that's part of it as well as an education around what that really means.
I think just from the standpoint of where I come from, and you hear this a lot, that MERS is moving the goalpost. And I was going to give Chris a pass on it today because it's his thing. But that issue is often viewed perhaps not in the right way. So MERS essentially has decided that they want to try to be safe and keep those funds safe and funded appropriately, which is why they're whacking a year off the amortization every time. That does complicate things for municipalities, because then that adds, right, they're going this way and they're going that way. And this comes to the point that we've been talking about. How do we, wrap our arms around that discussion? Because what they're doing is protecting your money. Now, it is causing some, problems with municipalities. And they're not the only one doing that. So that's the kind of thing where, Tony and I are in the trenches, dealing with how do you balance, protecting the benefit for people that are getting it and providing services to people that are on the job, and then what do you do with people that aren't on the job yet? So MERS takes a lot of abuse over that, perhaps justifiably so, but they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, realistically.
And the most, people in this room know, but the most important term is intergenerational equity, which is a long-winded way of saying, who's going to pay for this obligation you're incurring now? How much should be borne by current taxpayers? How much should be borne by future taxpayers? And that basic question is underlying all these discussions we always have. It's a lot of technical questions, amortization, all that kind of stuff, but that is a fundamental policy question. How much are we going to pay today for commitments we're making today, and how much are we going to pay tomorrow? And then what's it do today's budget to meet those commitments down the road? There's no good answer here, but we know pushing it all down the road is the bad answer. Paying it all today is the wrong answer. It's somewhere in between.
Yeah, and I just wanted the idea of intergenerational equity, which I can't even say. That's one of the things too that makes me nervous, because the easy accounting answer is we fix it all right now. We fully fund and we pay all the normal costs. We do all that stuff, and that puts it all on the people that are paying right now. And that's not the right answer either, because their services are going to suffer tremendously. And so I think, we're 50 years plus into a problem. We need to have a long horizon of how we get out of this problem, something that allows us to keep that balance appropriate on all measures of that intergenerational equity issue.
Yep. If you don't know what that means, you need to look it up. I looked it up, and when, from my perspective and his, this is where we kind of run afoul of what, black and white folks think about what that should look like. Because in the, fantasy scenario, that's awesome. That's what you're supposed to do. But as Tony pointed out, this is a problem that's been here for 50 years. It's going to be for the next 50. So that's the balance you got to strike, and that's where we go round and round.
Right, it is a balance.
Great conversations.
Yeah, there's this big buildup of unfunded liability, and how long should it take to pay that off is really an important issue in what we've been talking about. You can't pay it off today. It took many, many years to accumulate. I think the issue we're debating now is, but what about current obligations we're making this year? Shouldn't you be funding that? Not just on a pay-as-you-go basis, but shouldn't you be what's called a normal cost? Shouldn't you be at least funding and keeping the hole from getting bigger? And that's a debate we're having now.
For healthcare, right?
Healthcare, I'm sorry.
We're already doing it.
Pensions by law,
Yeah.
you are paying both your piece of the unfunded liability and your normal costs. It's required by the Constitution and by statute. We're talking healthcare. Thank you, Chris.
We should do a breakout on that topic. We can do that.
What's that?
We can do a breakout on that
Oh,
topic.
we're going to have months of breaking out on that topic.
So the next question in the app is from a community. They have no retiree health care. They're 96% funded. They comment first on how it feels like there could be a feeling of those types of communities being punished because of the small number of municipalities that are unable to fund their liabilities. And they want you to talk about the likelihood of there being a one-size-fits-all solution coming down. I know that's been a topic really from all of you.
Well, again, I think we're trying to avoid a one-size-fits-all, and I don't think anything that any of us anticipate doing would be punitive on communities. If that's their circumstance, sounds to me like they're positioned fairly well in the space. But do you set up a framework that, again, makes this sustainable on a long-term basis? It's easy to point at certain communities and say, my God, look at this legacy problem they've got. It's unfunded. They got 6 employees for every retiree. We ignored the fact that half the community might have moved out and walked out on the bill. It's like when you're the last one at the bar and everyone leaves and they hand you the tab. You're like, well, wait a second. There was 10 people who were drinking a second ago. They're not there now. We ignore that part of the problem. So this is not something that is as simple as we're smarter than you. We've got it right. You got it wrong. We have communities at different stages in their life cycle. We have communities that got to benefit by learning about because of what happened in some of those other places. So maybe they've structured it differently going forward. I think labor's done the same thing. They figured out, hey, what we were doing isn't sustainable, and some of the contracts reflect some of that stuff. So we're trying to get there. So I think we got to have a framework that allows everyone to get to a sustainable place, and it's going to take some time to get there.
Thank you, Tony. Next question. What are examples of measures that will be taken for those communities that are upside down or can't help themselves with an action plan?
What are the metrics we'd measure them, or what are the solutions? I'm a little confused.
Measures as in actions that would be taken.
You know, we're talking about 2 measures as part of the task force, and that will probably retain in the legislation. And there's really, as we've been saying all along the last hour or so, there's how much is funded, how big is your unfunded liability, and then how, even if you're keeping up with your payments, but it's eating a growing share of your budget, that's a problem too. So the metrics we're going to use is what's your unfunded ratio, your funded ratio, and then what % of your general fund expenditures are going towards retiree health care and pensions.
Yeah,
and we have different thresholds we're talking about, but you know, if it's representing 10 to 15 to 20% of your expenditures, even if you have a relatively well-funded plan, you still got an issue because it's going to increase and crowd out more and more spending.
I heard that question is measure steps, not measures.
Yeah.
Metrics?
I
was a
think,
little confused.
or for example, corrective actions.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
So
what
what
is
type
the
of
policy
corrective
plan? That's what I thought you
Yeah.
said,
Yeah.
metrics. Okay, forget everything I just said.
That was
You know, right now, in the little chart you saw before, the way it would work from the task force is you'd get a problem, and then I think everyone in the task force agreed that the best solution is to have the local government and the employees and their representatives work out a plan that's financially healthy. You know, it puts the local unit on a financially stable path. And whether they do that through more taxes or less benefits or whatever, you know, in some ways it's simple math. You reduce benefits, you increase taxes, that's about all you can do. So the first step is, can they, locals on a local level representing what the local taxpayers want, find a plan that's financially stable? And that's it. And then the second question we can agree on is what if they can't? Then what happens? And then that's what we're going to debate. What happens if they can't agree on a plan or a plan isn't implemented? And then the final issue is what Chris mentioned, is there are a small group of local units of government on the pension side that aren't going to get here from there. They're just not. I mean, they don't have the tax base. They're upside down and they're retiree active workers. So they can't address benefits. They can't really address tax base. We're going to have to address that. Luckily, it's a relatively small group of districts. I don't have a solution for that. I have a lot of solutions for that, and all of them are very difficult, both from a financial standpoint, from a political standpoint. But there's a small group of districts whose problem is going to have to be socialized, and we got to figure out who's going to pay. And bankruptcy, let's be clear, bankruptcy is an option. It's a very bad option, but bankruptcy is an option.
And if I could add to Nick's answer a little bit. I mean, so in my mind, the framework of what makes sense to us is, you know, if we're going to have 2017 healthcare, you need 2017 plan design. So modernizing plan designs is something that makes sense to us as a way to make this sustainable into the future. I think we've learned, and I think you see contracts heading in this direction now. We're closing off new plans, so we're kind of closing off the expansion of some of that stuff. If we can sort of box it in and then squeeze the box a little bit by being smarter about how we provide the benefits, to me, that's a huge first step, and probably for the vast majority of places, get you where you need to go. As Nick points out, there's a handful of places that are incredibly upside down, and that conversation probably has more to do with our municipal finance system than it does OPEB, which again, we've limited our conversation in that room to that topic. I mean, that's a symptom of a much broader problem. We got to think about how do you make those places sustainable in a broad sense, not just as it relates to this.
I'm sure it wouldn't come to surprise to most folks in here that not only are we sitting in a municipality that struggles with this issue, but many of us probably drove through several of them on the way here. And the employees in those municipalities could work for free and it would not solve the problem. The good news is that there's not that many, comparatively speaking. So that's good news, because we're all going to pay for that, by the way. It's coming, and that's fine. But the question, I think you can't, from a labor perspective, I'm not sure we can highlight this enough. These two guys here have said it, and it's an important concept, right? There's local government with their employees collaboratively working together to solve this issue. There are times when you are not going to be able to do it, and that's when the big guy gets involved, and then you got some tough questions to answer. But we have been doing that. We're going to continue to do that. It's a slow process. But it didn't appear that there was going to be some penalty for people that are playing the game the right way, right? You file your report, you're good to go, rock on. Nobody's getting in your business. So I think this is good.
You know, I should add that we're still debating what these thresholds are. You know, this filter I talked about, you start here, you know, the filters we've been talking about, they're, depending on how you measure it, 1,300, 1,500 local governments in Michigan. Maybe 70, 75 would be captured in this first round of the filter. So we're not talking about a broad net.
The next question, I'm going to take two different questions and put them into a two-part question. I'm going to throw it at Chris. The first part of the question is around, did the task force have any discussion with healthcare insurance companies about unfunded healthcare costs? And the follow-up to that is then, what are we seeing local communities doing to address those OPEB unfunded costs, or what steps could a community take? So two parts.
That's a great question, by the way.
Discussion with healthcare companies, did the task force have those?
On the first question, there was a representative from Blue Cross Blue Shield on the task force, but I don't think we got into sort of the global issue of how healthcare costs are growing and at greater than the rate of inflation, and you know, which is part of the problem. So no, I think the answer is no. On what are municipalities doing, I'll start, but you guys see this all the time. The first thing is that 2/3 of municipalities don't provide retiree health care to start, so that group's out to start with. Some of those are starting healthcare savings plans with MERS or with other vendors to save for retirement because they know it's important. Other than that, they're going to the table and making changes in benefits. They're either closing the plan to new actives, they are increasing costs, they're changing plan design. It's a whole raft of choices that are there. Everyone's different. And then lastly, they're beginning to fund. So they're starting to save money and either investing it in their municipality or they're asking MERS to invest it for them along with our portfolio.
I think so. What we know about healthcare is that the costs are driven by utilization, right? And that number is fuzzy because you don't know it until it's too late. So you want to, you know, and people that don't necessarily recognize this issue don't understand what a significant problem it is, because there's no predicting what's going to happen, right? Because everybody in here, right, is in a group, and if your head falls off and you got to sew it back on, everybody pays for that, and that drives costs. So what are employers doing? What are employees doing? Not a lot, right? Stop smoking, lose weight, you know, blah blah blah. And that is going to be a problem, big time.
But it's one thing the governor keeps asking, and I don't have an answer, which is that for all of us, the easiest answer is how do we bend the cost curve, is what people are talking about. How do we provide the same level of services more efficiently and effectively? Or how do we provide the same level of services and make somebody else pick it up, namely the federal government? It is by far the answer I know so little about, and I know everybody's been talking about it. Some states have been a little bit successful, some states have been a lot successful. There are a lot of people in this space who are thinking about it and working it, but clearly if there's something we can do to reduce the cost, that's just something we can all support right away. I just don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, there's no shortage of solutions for sure, and that's part of the challenge, right? I mean, there's a million ways to get at this. I think setting that framework and that legal authority to make that happen is going to be really important.
Okay, moving to Tony. There are a handful of combinations of statements and questions, but I'm going to funnel them all to this one question that states, We will all benefit from Tony discussing the impact of the state government's significant decrease in revenue sharing and what that has had on local units of government. So the question is, we're going to benefit from you
Question
talking
statement.
about
My
it, so
opportunity
please talk
to,
about it.
Punch Nick a couple
And
times.
I get the answer.
No, it's to me, shut up. So, I mean, so, as a lot of you know, I mean, I've been going all around the state talking about we characterize our broken, municipal finance system. We have a system that doesn't work terribly effectively for us right now. And revenue sharing has been something that, this is not a shot against the current administration. This goes all the way back to Engler, the entirety of Granholm, and continues to this day, underfunding revenue sharing. And that has had an impact on it. It's $8 billion statewide that has been removed from the funding. We can't pretend that hasn't had an impact. Our property tax system doesn't work. It's equally as ineffective. We saw that in living color during the recession. I think it's very important that we take a very thoughtful look at that as well. And Nick opened with it, so I'll give him his props on that. I mean, this is a broader conversation than this. This is a huge problem. $20 billion, give or take, in total across the state. And so it's definitely worthy of a lot of attention, but it is only one part of that problem. And we've got to take a look at how do we build a revenue system that can sustain local government. It's got to track with the economy. What we have now does not. Any revenue system is going to have that as a feature of it. And as Nick points out, service provision and how we utilize, assets across the state. We doubled our infrastructure across the state. We haven't added any people. That's not a sustainable conversation. We got to be smarter about how we do that stuff.
Thank you. The next question is for Chris. What solution or legislation is currently being advocated by MERS lobbyists? Just the task force recommendations or something more or different?
I think we work from a set of principles. The first is do no harm, which there was early discussion of closing all defined benefit pension plans, and we think that would create a fair amount of harm and increased costs, so that's probably our first interest. After that, the evidence is pretty clear to us that local units of government, save a handful, are taking steps to mitigate these liabilities, both pension and health care, and so we don't want to have anything that gets in the way of that. After that, we just want to make sure that whatever we come up with will ensure that the participants that have been promised these benefits, such as they are, ultimately are able to get the benefits.
Thank you. The next question is asking for the panel to discuss the pros and cons of bonding for unfunded liabilities.
Well, I'll start. I like bonding. I love bonds. Both in the public sector and private sector, I've probably been responsible for issuing more debt than anyone in the state. So I love bonds when used right. Bonding traditionally, the old saw from public finances, when you have a long-lived asset, you bond. So again, intergenerational equity, those people using the road 20 years pay for it. That's what bonding does instead of paying for it today. This is not that. This is a service that's provided, an operating expenditure that's provided to retirees. Should it be bonded? Mostly no. People, bonding isn't a solution, doesn't create any money. It just moves around who's going to pay for it. So I think what's going to happen, and it's happened in other states, is people did pension bonds, and then they got way underwater in debt. In 20 years or 10 years, they woke up and they had all this debt they couldn't afford. So I view bonding as a very, very narrow, useful tool. Now, if you've closed your plan, you've frozen your plan, so your liability is known and measurable and can't be moved no matter what, then issuing a bond may make some sense. But, I think it's a real disservice to taxpayers broadly when a local government says, I'm 100% funded because I just issued a bond and put the money from, I just put the liability from one side of my balance sheet to the other. It's still there. I still owe $100, but now instead of owing $100 to the pension plan, it's owing $100 of outstanding debt. And let me tell you, it's converting from at least an OPEB liability that can be changed to a principal and interest that you cannot change. So, you know, I think in most cases, it's just kicking the can down the road. In some cases, it makes sense, but most cases it doesn't. That's just me. Other people love it. People have done it. There's statutory authority to do it. In 12 months, you're going to have another treasurer, and they may be much more open to doing it. But I'm going to come back in 10 years, and all the local governments who did it are going to complain about not being able to support their debt service.
From a lay perspective, a lot of places, this is like the Vogue thing. If you can afford to do it, they try to do it. And so we had a discussion on this, and there's at least 5 accountants in the room that got very excited when this topic came up. And essentially, you just move it from here to there, right? So you have to report on your balance sheet this unfunded liability. So what do, right? You borrow money, and now you don't. Hey, I don't have any, but it's still there,
It's
right?
still there.
Just like the unfunded liability, it's been there this whole time. It's still going to be there. It just moves it from there to there, and from a reporting standpoint, people get excited about that. Apparently, it does not solve the problem. It's still there.
Yeah, and I'll be brief. I agree with Nick. I think if you got a closed system, it's a tool and something you should consider. It's not a panacea. It's certainly not something that I would be strongly advocating for, but I think it's an important tool to have available for folks because in some circumstances that makes sense to do.
Thank you. We are at just a little bit longer, so I'm going to move. I'm trying to get
I
every
think we have
question
time.
in here.
We have time for one more question.
One more question. There are several comments and questions in the feed around, there's conversations about if you can or cannot impact retirees, a lot of conversations about current employees, but there's questions around what's the future hold for new employees coming in and the benefits that they're offered. And so I'm funneling all of those comments and questions into one question that was received on, did the task force talk about retirement security and the impacts to the state of Michigan?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of conversation around that. I think everyone's goal in that room, regardless of who you represented, was we need to have a benefits that's sustainable. If I'm an employee that gets hired today, I want to know I can rely on what I'm being told I'm going to get, whether that's pensions, whether that's OPEB, or my wages for that matter. That's the goal of this entire conversation, is how do you do that in a way that doesn't result in what could become an unsustainable benefit. And if we were building this today, if this panel was, we're going to start a government tomorrow, how do we want to do pension and OPEB? I think we all know how to do that the right way if we started today. Unfortunately, we're dragging an anchor that we've been building for 50 years forward, so we can't ignore that as we look at how we go forward.
I gotta chime in a little bit here. Does that mean we're late? Is that what that clock says?
It means I'm
Just a
late.
little bit.
I got to get back
Just
to
a little
Lansing.
bit.
I'm here all day. Yeah.
We're trying to get on the boat thing, right?
No, we're not invited to the boat thing. Who's in charge?
We'll crash.
You can come.
You're all invited.
No, I'm not gonna. That'd be bad. So I think this is like the debate we're going to be having, and my father's a former Marine, retired policeman, living in Florida on a meager pension. Eating cat food if you talk to him, and he's concerned about it, and justifiably so. And people should be concerned about it because the discussion's not going away, right? This task force was good, great talks, but there are people that don't think you should have that benefit. There are people in the legislature right now that don't want you to have that benefit. As a matter of fact, we talk about mortality tables. I joke all the time that your employer probably would wish you die on the job so you don't cost them any more money. And that's a fact, all right? So laugh or not. But the good news is that there's a focus and discussed about, listen, we really can't be hurting people that have been retired. You can't plan for this. There's no way that they can afford the pressures that would be put on them. Like Tony says, if we were to start this over today, this would not be the way you do it. So even the governor, to his credit, he's like, listen, not to me necessarily, don't hurt active retirees, okay? Those people earn that benefit through labor, and to take it away from them is unjust, is not even the right word. But there are those out there, and Tony and his people, and Mac and the Michigan Township Association, we're all advocating, on behalf of those people. So Something has to be addressed there. We talked about healthcare and those costs earlier. Tony talks about modernization, which always makes me a little nervous. I'm not sure what that means. But you know, those things are all being discussed. They have to be discussed. You can't ignore it. So you know, you got to be vigilant. You know, stay in contact with your legislators. You know, have these conversations with them, and you know, hopefully things turn out.
Well, thank you so much for sharing the insights into the task force. And as we've heard over the last hour to 15 minutes, this is a very complex issue with many facets. And thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.